Okay, we'll start lecture now. So first things first, it's everyone's favorite time of the year. It's subject evaluation time. Please fill out all of your evaluations. They're important. We read them. We use them to improve the class. I've actually got some special questions into the 033 lecture this year that I'm really interested to see how people respond. So special plea for me to do this for 033. But I'll remind you a couple more times. I think they're open until finals, roughly. 6033 in the news. Very, very timely. So
Yes.
this happened on Saturday, I think. Um, an attack on part of the U.S. fuel pipeline. So in fact, part of the pipeline on the East Coast. And I pulled out a few choice quotes from this article from Politico. So one of the things at the top that I've pulled out is noting that this is an attack on infrastructure. So things like water plants, oil refineries, electric grid, all of that. This is the kind of scenario that I want you all to have in mind when we are thinking about security. Like, it is really bad if adversaries, steal your credit card data. Like, that is really bad, but that is sort of bad for you and your immediate family, like a localized group of people. It's very, very bad when infrastructure gets attacked. This impacts quite a few people. And so you can see down here, Ed Markey, a senator from Massachusetts, in noting that the government has kind of failed to devote attention to the security of this pipeline. So this happened on Saturday. Yesterday, there was, I don't know if Biden has actually come out with this plan yet, but is planning a plan to sort of strengthen our cyber defenses. You can see in the top right here a few of the ideas requiring things like two-factor authentication, requiring zero trust to software vendors, which means giving them access to federal systems only when necessary. And honestly, I read this and I thought, oh my gosh, were we not already doing that? The thing that really got me was down here at the bottom right. You can see them discussing a little bit about how some of these attacks have been made. And I'll just like circle this choice line. Um, despite this system having all sorts of access to federal networks, the password to do the software updates was SolarWinds 123, and SolarWinds is the name of the company. So like that is not a hard password to guess. And they let an intern set it. If I found out that one of you all went out to an internship and did this, I'd be so mad, so mad. And one of the other things from this article mentions a bill in 2012 that was attempting to regulate cybersecurity standards, which was not, it didn't go through because people argued that it was too expensive and too onerous. And this is what happens when we don't have those types of regulations. So 6033 in the news, super relevant, super recent, as always happens during the security section of this class. So what are we going to talk about today? We've been dealing with systems where we had an adversary trying to access data on a server, right? And I've put our client server model up here. I've used a slightly different term that we haven't seen yet in this class. A lot of times we'll talk about the principle in the world of security. The principle is just the thing that identifies the client on the server. So like think usernames and things like that. I don't know why that word didn't come up for us last week, but it didn't. So I thought I'd throw it out here now. This week, we're going to move our general adversary, right? So we're going out from just a single machine, and we're going to look at adversaries that are observing data on a network, right? So first, let's just imagine, if the adversary is looking at network data. So first of all, how does that happen? Right. Well, if you're on a network like a broadcast network, like a wireless network, your machine can just hear all of the packets that are going by. I mean, it's like standing in a crowded room and people are having conversations. You could stand next to somebody and eavesdrop on their conversation, right? Even if you're thinking of wired networks, adversaries could have access, say, to switches in the middle of the network, right? So when you look at network data, sometimes it can be really difficult to interpret. So it can look something like this, all right? So this is like real network data. The way it's formatted here is this top part, that's the packet header, right? And kind of a bunch of different packet headers. It has a lot of things, a lot more things than we've talked about. You can see I've highlighted the IP addresses, so to and from. You can see the packet data down here, which just kind of looks like garbage. It doesn't look like anything that's easy to interpret. But you might look at this and say like, well, could I learn something about this user? Like, hey, I can see the IP addresses. Can I tell, who's sending this data? Not always. All right, so you can see what I did here is I just ran dig on that first IP address. It's hosted by Akamai, so it's hard to tell exactly what it is, exactly who's doing what. But not all internet traffic is like this. Right, so here are some examples of times when you can tell what a user is doing on a network. And I'm going to focus in specifically on packet data here, not just the packet headers. Right, so this is some data from students in lecture a couple years ago. So you can see here I've highlighted the sort of interesting things. This host here, tinycore.potter. This turns out to be like a phone game, a Harry Potter style phone game. You can see that this person was part of Slytherin, I'm going to assume. There were all sorts of outfits that you could pick for your characters. It was very exciting. You can see here, this is a person that's downloading the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, all from D&D, right? So you can see all of that just in the data. And you might look at that and say, well, I'm in like in a crowd, who cares if somebody's downloading the Dungeon Master's Guide? Like, it's fine. It's a great thing to have, right? But, you usually kind of think like, oh, nobody can tie my traffic back to me, right? Especially when you look at things like, well, all we've got up here are these IP addresses, right? Who knows who exactly 18.4.86.46 was, right? And that is true to a large extent. In fact, that's going to cause us some problems next week. But sometimes there are other things that can let you tie traffic to a specific person. For instance, for any of you that have ever owned an iPhone, this may be true on Android phones as well, but definitely on iPhone. A lot of times when you buy a new iPhone and set it up, it'll give it a default name, and it'll be like Katrina's iPhone, or even like Katrina Lakurtz's iPhone, or Karen's iPhone, Howie's iPhone, right? Something like that. Those names get broadcast all over the network, right? So this, I'm anonymizing whatever traffic this was, but this was just, person's name.iphone.local. So that name goes over the network a lot. You can see it in headers, you can see it in packet data. Apple does the same thing like with your laptops. It'll try to default them to, Katrina Lakurtz's like MacBook or whatever, which is a very long, it's a wild name for a machine. So this is all stuff that, we'd kind of like to avoid. Like, from the standpoint of security, it would be great if this weren't possible, right? So that's what we're going to focus on this week. Today, specifically, we're going to look at how to protect packet data from an adversary. On Wednesday, we're going to care more about protecting some meta information, so things like packet headers. So today, we're thinking about an adversary in the network, right? If, say, I'm communicating with Karen, that adversary is going to learn that I'm communicating with Karen, but our goal is that it's not going to learn very much more, right? And if you're looking at this and maybe you're coming from, I don't know, you just have experiences in other places, and you're thinking like, well, people should be encrypting their data. Yes, that is where we're headed. Okay, but we're going to talk about encryption. We're going to talk about some other things along with this, right? So here's what we're going to try to provide today. We're going to provide two things, right? Confidentiality and integrity. Confidentiality means that an adversary can't learn the contents of our messages. So if I'm sending data to Karen, the adversary might see that data go by, but doesn't know what it says. Integrity means that they also cannot tamper with it. So they can't change it in a meaningful way and go undetected. So let me give you an example of when we don't have either of those things. Right? Suppose that I'm sending the grades file to Karen, grades.txt, right? It has all the 6033 grades. And I send it to Karen. I'll let you all be the adversaries in the network today just for fun. If you all observe that data going by, it's unencrypted, it's just going by in plain text. It's not like hashed or anything like that. Now you can just read everybody's grade, right? We would not have confidentiality. We would also not have integrity because you could take that data, sort of rip it out of the network, say you own a switch or something, intercept it, change a grade, right? You could say, okay, here's my line in the spreadsheet, I'm going to change it to an A+, right? And then send it back to Karen. Karen would not know that anything had happened, right? That looks like a totally valid grade. If you tried to change it to like a grade of like K or something, like, okay, yeah, something has gone wrong, but we would have neither confidentiality nor integrity. So we're going to try to get both of these things. And we are going to allow for a relatively powerful adversary in this context. So our adversary can observe network data, so they can just be sort of a passive adversary looking at things, but they can also take a more active role. So trying to tamper with packets, insert their own packets, maybe save a packet, send it back later. Okay, so that we're going to let them do quite a few things. All right, so let's see how we're going to make this work. We're going to make this work by relying on a couple of different cryptographic primitives. And because this isn't a math class, we're not going to go into all of the math that backs these primitives. We'd need like, at least another week of lecture, if not 2 weeks of lecture, right? Instead, we're going to focus our skills on sort of how do we take these cryptographic primitives, how do we take these building blocks, sort of, and use them to construct a secure channel. So if we can provide confidentiality and integrity, we have what is known as a secure channel. All right. So most of this lecture, I'm going to do this, I'm going to sort of show you how to put these building blocks together. It's going to get you well on your way to building a secure channel. At the very end of lecture, I'll show you an example of like a real secure channel protocol. So there are some details that we aren't able to get to in this class, but you'll be so much of the way there. All right. So let's get our first cryptographic primitive out of the way. It's as Johnny says, you could take 6857 later and you'll be all set. All right, so the first thing we're going to do, we need encryption. Right, so what's going on here? So encrypt and decrypt. Encrypt takes a key, K, and a message and outputs a ciphertext. Decrypt effectively does the reverse. Give it that key, give it that ciphertext, it'll get back the message. So here's just an example, right? What I did here is I picked a key. So you can see my kind of random key here. Not really random, but I picked a key. Here's the message, hello world, all right? I picked an encryption scheme. There's more than one. There's not that many, but there's more than one, right? And you can see the ciphertext that I get, which is this long kind of hex string. On the decrypt side, using that same key, take that ciphertext, I get back hello world. One thing to know is that, I picked a short example for the slide. If I had encrypted a really, really long string, like the text of War and Peace or something, I would get a really, really long ciphertext, right? We expect the length of the ciphertext to be comparable to the length of the message, right? So what's the property that we get from this? Why is this special, right? Given the way encryption functions are constructed and their corresponding decrypt functions, given the ciphertext, it is impossible to obtain the message without having the key. All right, so Karen and I are going to be sending data to each other today in lecture. All right, here's us, right? I'll be this, Karen can be the server. We're going to send the ciphertext. All right, so here's our adversary sitting in the middle. So they observe the ciphertext, right? They don't know the key. For right now, we're going to assume Karen and I, we're sharing a key. It's a secret. Only Karen and I know it. So if the adversary looks at the ciphertext, they can't get the message. Right? They can't get the message because of this property. So this is a rare time in O33 where like slide 1, we get one of the things we're looking for, right? This encryption gives us confidentiality. It's great. However, it does not give us the other thing, right? Encryption is not enough to give integrity, right? So the way you can think about this, and again, this is one of the places that, you know, if this were a more math style class, if this were 857, we would talk mathematically about why. What you can imagine here is that one thing that an adversary can do with the ciphertext, intercept it, right, which means, you know, get it, remove it from the network, and change a few bits, right? That adversary might not know exactly what they're doing, right? But changing the bits in a specific way and then putting it back into the network, sending it to Karen, might be enough to get it to decrypt to a different message. And there are cases where that's enough to make an attack. One way that I sort of like to think about this is if you imagine an encryption scheme where like most ciphertexts are valid, right? You might change from one ciphertext to another. At a super high level mathematically, the fact that encrypt and decrypt exist as a pair, right? The fact that there has to be this reverse function makes it hard to provide integrity. Right, so you can read more about this in the textbook. It's section 11.4.4. All right, if you don't feel like reading the textbook, it's okay. If you don't feel like reading the textbook, I need you to trust me that encryption does not provide integrity. It gets us confidentiality. It doesn't get us integrity. But the next thing does. All right, we're going to add a second primitive. It is called a, oh, we're not going to do it yet. We're going to try a different idea. That's not going to work. All right, what if we did this? What if we sent the ciphertext along with its hash? All right, I bring this up here. Some of you might have thought about this. Some of you might not have thought about this. Either one's okay. But the reason I'm sort of pushing us in this direction is a lot of times we use hash functions or something similar to a hash function to this, where I'll send a piece of data along with the hash of its data. If the data gets corrupted in some way, I can do a real quick check because the hash isn't gonna work out. In the context of a secure channel, this isn't quite enough for us. Because if the adversary wants to tamper with the ciphertext and change it in a particular way, they can also change the hash, right? Remember that hash functions, they're not a secret. There's not that many of them. It's very reasonable that the adversary would know what hash function we're using. But what we're going to use is not so dissimilar from this, right? Instead of using a normal hash function, we are going to use what is known as a MAC. So MAC stands for Message Authentication Code in this context. And you can see what it's doing here. It's set up similar to an encrypt function. It takes a key and it takes a message, right? In this case, the output we refer to as a token. The token is a fixed length, right? And here are some properties. Given the message, you cannot compute the token without knowing the key, right? And you actually also can't go in the reverse direction, right? If you have the token, you can't get the message back, even with the key, right? This is a lot like the hash functions that you saw last week in certain ways. The primary difference is that this MAC function, it's using a key, right? You could even call this a keyed hash function, right? So with a normal hash function, it's very easy for an adversary to compute the hash of a message, right? But with MACs, the adversary can't do this computation unless they know the key, right? But again, notice that this is different from the encrypt function, right? Even though they're taking the same arguments, there's no reverse. There's no like DMAC, right? Where you get a token and a key and you get the message back. That's not available to us because of how this function is mathematically constructed, right? So let's see how we're going to use these together. Here is our abstraction so far. All right, I'm going to Alice and Bob, common cryptographic friends, Alice and Bob. So here's what Alice is going to do. She's got her message M. She's going to encrypt it with a key, get a ciphertext. She's going to MAC that ciphertext. In practice, we would have different keys, one for encrypting, one for MACing. right? For just ease of the slides, we're going to use the same key here, right? But in practice, they have to have different keys, but this is going to work fine for this. All right, so Alice has her ciphertext. She has the MAC. She's going to send both of them along. All right, she sends the ciphertext concatenated with the MAC. All right, Bob receives this. He can check, right? Check that the MAC works out, right? Make sure that the MAC of that ciphertext is indeed what Karen sent. And then he can decrypt. Right, so this is where we're starting. Right, we've done two things. We've encrypted, we've MAC'd. Right, and then the receiver checks the MAC and decrypts. So if we imagine an adversary in the middle of the network, if we imagine Eve sitting here in the middle of the network, if Eve is just looking at the packet, right? Eve sees the ciphertext. Eve can't get back the message, right? Eve sees the MAC token. Eve can't get back the message, right? Those are the properties that we have here on the left, right? And in fact, if Eve wants to tamper with the ciphertext, you know, Eve cannot. She'd also have to change the MAC in a really specific way. There's no way she would be able to get that to match up, right? The probability of that happening is zero. It's basically zero, right? So it seems like we're good to go, right? Oh, Miller, how do a client and server initially obtain a secure key that they communicate with? We're going to come to that. Right now, we're just believing that Alice and Bob have this key. We'll get to that in like 10 minutes, right? So what else could, Johnny, it is fun. Yes, it's fun. It's fun, and then we're going to break it, and then we're going to need a whole new thing. It's going to be great. You guys are going to have a great time for the next 30 minutes. All right. So Eve's in the middle here. You know, she looks at this message. Actually, things are going really well for us. This is good. Except Eve is tricky, right? And Eve is allowed to take a more active role in this process. Here's something that Eve could do. All right. She could mount what is known as a replay attack. All right. So Eve could take this message that she sees Alice send to Bob, just store it, and just send it over and over and over. Imagine if that message says something like, hey, you know, transmit or, you know, deposit $100 into Alice's bank account, right? Eve can just replay, all right? And Bob just keeps depositing $100 into Alice's bank account, right? Maybe it's even better for Eve if that message happens to say, deposit $100 in Eve's bank account, right? So we don't want this, all right? And then notice that Eve didn't actually read anything about the message or tamper with it. She just copied it and sent it again, right? You all actually know a way to deal with this. You know how to prevent a system from acting on duplicate messages, right? The way that we can prevent that is to add sequence numbers. Right? We don't need another cryptographic thing yet, right? We can just be a little bit smarter about our stream of messages between Alice and Bob. All right, so that's what you're going to see on the next slide. Same ideas, encrypting and MACing, but now we'll just have sequence numbers. All right, so again, if Eve in the middle here intercepts the message, it just sees the ciphertext and MAC for a particular message combined with a particular sequence number. In a secure channel, we guarantee the sequence numbers are not reused. All right, so Alice is not going to send, if this is message with sequence number 400, Alice is not going to send another message with sequence number 400 to Bob. Right? There's a whole protocol, the whole part of these protocols to make sure that never happens. So we do not have to worry about that. All right, so it seems like things are going well. All right, it seems like. But Eve, again, it's very tricky. So even though we have, you know, in this scheme, I've got Alice communicating with Bob. There's no reason that Bob might not also be communicating with Alice, or they're having like a two-way conversation. So in this case, Eve could do one more pretty tricky thing. She could take this message, right? If she intercepts it and tries to send it again to Bob, Bob is going to say, no, I already processed the sequence number. This is just a duplicate. I'm just ignoring it. But Eve could send it in the opposite direction, right? This is known as a reflection attack. It's really similar to a replay attack, But typically when we talk about sending a message back to the person who sent it, we call it a reflection attack, right? It is very possible that Bob at some point, he has his own sequence number space that he's sending to Alice, right? This message with this sequence number may be valid at a particular point to Alice. When I learned this, I was like, come on, everybody. Like, how likely is this, right? Like, just how likely is this? Imagine Eve. Eve has a computer. Eve can just be spamming this message forever, right? At some point, if sequence number 400 is no longer valid from Alice to Bob, it could very well be valid from Bob to Alice. Right? So as improbable as this attack might be, we don't want this to happen, right? And we can fix this, right? This is a relatively straightforward fix from where we've been going, right? So I'm going to show you the same setup, right? Alice and Bob, and notice that it's the exact same thing, but I've subscripted everything with the letter A, right? This is to illustrate the fact that, what we're going to do? We're going to use different keys in each direction, right? So a message from Alice to Bob is not a valid message from Bob to Alice. It wouldn't be encrypted with the same key. Like if Alice got that message, it would decrypt to garbage, right? So this is where we're going to land for this part of our secure channel, right? We encrypt, we MAC, we use sequence numbers, and we use different sequence numbers and different keys in each direction, right? To deal with those reflection attacks and replay attacks, right? So Miller, get ready. We haven't talked much about these keys. How did Alice and Bob get this key in the first place, right? Given what you know, they are surely not just going to send it in the clear across the network, right? This would not work well. You could imagine, like if you imagine this happening in the real world, you imagine, Karen and I always wanting to protect ourselves from the adversary that is Howie. Like maybe Karen and I, we meet in one of our offices and like we write the key down on a piece of paper and we memorize it and we burn the paper and we do something like that. That would be fun. But we're going to exchange keys with the power of math, right? So I want to show you the math because it's very cool. I thought this was very cool the first time I learned it. This is an important thing, and also it's going to break, right? And I need you to understand where it's going to break. But let me reassure you something about the math. This is not math we would ask you to do on an exam, okay? Some of you might come in, you might have seen this before, you might have had the background from this. Others of you may never have seen this. Those are all okay, all right? So here is how we're going to do key exchange. This is known as Diffie-Hellman key exchange. Johnny, where are you? Are you excited? Are you ready? I'm gonna assume you can put it. Yes. Excellent. Okay, everybody get as hyped as Johnny is in the chat. All right, so here's how this is gonna work. We're gonna have Alice and Bob, as always. There are gonna be two numbers known to everybody. Everybody, including adversaries. These numbers are completely public. There's a number P, the prime number, right? And then there is a number G, right? G is G stands for generator in this context. And here's the property that relates P and G. Right? It's gonna take me a minute to explain. If I take that number G, right? Pick a random number like 30, right? I raise it to some power, right? Whatever power. And then I do G, that number mod P. So mod means divide by P and take the remainder. It's like that percent sign in Python, right? Like I'll put it in the chat. So like it's just like doing that in Python, right? It is impossible to determine this exponent, even if you know GMP, right? So if I send Karen G to the R mod P, Karen knows G, Karen knows P, Karen is not going to figure out R, right? Which, feels good if Karen's an adversary, but Karen and I are trying to share some data here, right? Like if the thing that we were trying to share was R, Karen can't figure out R, All right, so let's see how we're going to utilize this. All right, so Alice and Bob, they're both going to pick their random numbers. It can be whatever. Right? If imagine yourself as one of these parties, pick a random number in your head. All right, just pick it in your head. All right, you're not going to tell anyone. It's totally a secret. You're going to send, right, G raised to that power mod P, right, which looks a lot like what we saw up here. Right, that's intentional. That's not an accident. Right, so Alice sends Bob G to the A mod P. Bob sends Alice G to the B mod P. Now notice that at this point, if Bob gets G to the A mod P, Bob says, this is great, but I don't know what A is. All right, same, Alice says, well, I've got G to the B mod P, I don't know what B is. Right, so A and B are not the things that we're going to share. The thing that we're going to share is this. All right, so Alice takes that G to the B mod P, raises it to the 8th power. Remember, Alice knows A, nobody else knows A. Bob on his side takes G to the A mod P, which Alice sent him, raises it to the Bth power. These numbers are the same, right? So exponents, when you're using a mod, they work the way that you want them to, right? G to the B mod P to the A is the same as G to the A mod P to the B. Right? It's like saying 2 to the X to the Y is the same as 2 to the Y to the X, right? So they do what you want them to. So this is kind of neat, I think. One of the reasons I think this is neat is because it comes from like a very sort of pure mathematical place and is used in this really practical way, right? Except we're not actually going to be able to use it. And here is why, right? So same starting deal. Alice and Bob are going to get spread apart a little bit here. Alice has picked a random A. Bob has picked a random B, right? Eve is going to take, again, an active role, right? If Eve is just observing packets, Eve sees G to the A mod P, G to the B mod P, can't get A, can't get B, right? That's our property. B is going to sit in the middle here. And when A sends her number to B, Eve just intercepts it. Eve is not going to forward it along to B. She's going to send back this to Alice. Same thing's going to happen on Bob's side, right? The thing that Eve is doing in the middle here, she is, to Alice, she's basically pretending to be Bob. To Bob, she's pretending to be Alice, right? And neither Alice nor Bob know what's up. They're going to keep going. They're going to do this computation, right? They've basically exchanged a secret with Eve instead of with one another, right? This lets Eve calculate these two keys, right? And now if Alice is encrypting with her key, Eve is going to intercept the message, decrypt it, encrypt it, send it to B. Neither Alice nor B nor Bob is going to be the wiser, right? The problem here is not the math. The math is great. It's perfect. It's my favorite branch of math. The problem is that Alice and Bob don't know they're not talking to each other, right? The problem is a practical thing, right? When I send G to the A mod P to Karen, and when I get back G to the B mod P, how do I know that Karen sent it to me? How do I know it's not Howie, right? I don't. That is the failure here. So to fix this, we need an entirely different style of cryptography, right? This seems like, oh, it's such a small thing. No, this is a huge deal, right? We're going to talk about an entirely different style of cryptography, right? And again, I hope that you took something away from the math about this, but if you're only going to take away one thing, right, is that this key exchange, right, it is susceptible to an on-path attacker. Eve can just be between Alice and Bob, right? Alice and Bob don't know they're not talking to each other. So let's see how we're going to fix this. We're going to use signatures, right? Cryptographic signatures let users verify identities using what is known as public key cryptography. You're going to see this example today in lecture. On Wednesday, we're going to look at another example that uses public key cryptography. So this is going to stick with us for 2 lectures. All right, so here's what we need. Users are going to generate key pairs. there is a public key and a secret key, right? They're related mathematically. The public key, it's going to be known, it's public. Everybody's going to know it. How they will know it, we'll get to that. Right? The secret key is a secret, right? When I took cryptography as a grad student, my professor told me that your secret key lives in your heart, right? So it lives in your heart. You will also sometimes hear the secret key called the private key. I'm using secret on the slides because otherwise a lot of my abbreviations start with P. So we're going to go with public and secret, right? We can do two things. We can sign a message and we can verify a signature. Right, so when we sign a message, I use my secret key to sign a message and it outputs a signature. Right? You can verify that I did indeed create that signature if you have my public key. If you've ever seen anyone send you an email with like a cryptographic signature, that's the idea, right? It has kind of a similar flavor to the MACs that we were using, right? The sender sort of attaches a MAC and the receiver verifies it. So we're gonna think of something like this, right? So again, you cannot create a signature without the right secret key, right? So Howie's not going to be able to impersonate my signature unless he has my secret key, and my secret key lives in my heart. He's never going to get it. Also, unlike the previous keys, I never have to exchange the secret key with anyone. So it is realistic to imagine that it lives in my heart, right? So this is the setup we might see. It's going to add one additional step, right? Where we think about signing, right? So we have our message, we can encrypt it, we can MAC it, but we can also sign it, right? With a secret key. Send all of that along. And Bob can check all sorts of things, right? Bob can do the decryption. Bob can check that the MAC works out, and Bob can check that the signature works out, right? As long as he has Alice's public key. Right, now, I do want to say at this point, this is a rough outline of how we think about these signatures in the context of lecture. I'm going to show you an example at the end of lecture where we'll see how things like really work in the real world, but this is the basic idea. All right, think about encrypting a message, think about using a MAC for integrity, thinking about signing messages, right, to verify the identity of the sender. So this only works if Bob actually does have Alice's public key, right? The style of attack that you should be worried about, it's like, what if Eve is signing messages and Bob thinks that Eve's public key is Alice's public key? Like that would be a challenge, right? So let's think about that. How do we distribute public keys, right? How does Bob learn Alice's public key, right? Well, again, Bob could just like go over to Alice, like ask her for a file of her public key. The public key is not a secret, right? Like there's ways to exchange these out of band, but that's not super scalable. Doesn't work if we don't know each other, those types of things. So here's a starting idea. We're going to evolve this basically one step, right? So here we have Alice and Bob again. The notation I'm using here is _PK is a user's public key, _SK is their secret key. So Alice and Bob, they have their secret keys, known only to them, not shared with anyone in the network. And imagine that there is some centralized authority that keeps a name to public key mapping that says, this is Alice's public key, this is Bob's public key, right? And clients, consult that authority, right? So this authority is going to need its own key pair so that it can, it can sign messages. It's got its own public key. It's got its own secret key, right? So maybe, Alice shows up, she asks the server, hey, what is Bob's public key? She gets it, she communicates with Bob. If she needs to communicate with Bob again, maybe she reuses it, or maybe she asks again to double check because people do update their keys, right? This is not a bad idea, but it has some challenges. It doesn't scale, right? If we're asking a single centralized authority, right? Like you know that's not going to scale. And we would have to deal with, well, how do we get the server's public key out there, right? We have this kind of chicken and egg problem, all right? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to keep this idea. We're going to keep this idea of a server, but we're going to notice some things. This server can actually pre-compute signed messages that map names to their public key. So I'm going to start calling this server an authority. Right? So it might authorize messages like this. Let's say, here's Alice's public key, and I, the server, am signing it. Right? I'm signing it with my secret key. Right? That's what that notation means. All right, and now this message can be verified, right? As long as I have the server's public key. So we'll talk about how one would get that. But the server itself doesn't have to distribute these signed messages. So in fact, if Alice kind of registers herself with this authority, the authority will say, here is your signed message from me. It verifies that this is your public key. You can send this message along to anyone. All right. This might feel like a really obscure idea to all of you. You use this every single day. You use this to get to this lecture because that authority is known as a certificate authority, and that signed message is a certificate. So whenever you can't access the O33 submit site, right, it's because your certificate is out of date, right? It's because part of this process has broken. Right, so certificate authorities bring up all sorts of really interesting and challenging questions. Who should run them, right? Who should run the certificate authority, right? And you know that we have one for MIT, but there are lots of other certificate authorities. If any one of them sign a certificate, a browser will believe it. That can be problematic if some of the authorities are compromised or are they malicious. The way your browser gets that list of certificate authorities is that generally they just come installed in the browser. Right? So that's how you get the public keys for a lot of certificates. Right? To build this, we also would have to agree on sort of a structure for names, right? How to name principals, right? You can imagine a certificate authority, MIT certificate authority is not mapping your first name to your public key, right? So many of you have the same name, right? So that can't work. So we have to figure out a naming scheme, right? We also have the question of, well, what do we do if the certificate authority makes a mistake, right? We need a way to revoke certificates if something has gone wrong, right? This can be done, right? That can be done in a couple of different ways. One way is to have like a list of revoked certificates, a certificate revocation list in that clients periodically download. It works in theory. It doesn't really work in practice. They're sometimes incorrect. They're usually not updated on the weekends. So like there's some human intervention. There's all sorts of questions, right? Certificate authorities are not a perfect mechanism for this by any means. Right? Now, there is a way to avoid certificate authorities altogether, right? And this brings us back to like day 2, lecture 2 of O33, right? Because it's a naming issue, right? The issue here is that we have to publish this mapping of someone's name to their public key. Could just use the public keys as the names, right? And it has usability issues, right? But then we could try to work through a protocol for that. And there are such protocols. It works well for names that users don't have to like type and enter, right? So again, certificate authorities, they're not perfect. They're a mechanism for distributing public keys. You can't really talk about public key cryptography if you don't have a way to distribute those keys, but there's lots of questions. Right. So I promised at the end of lecture, I would show you an actual like protocol that does all of this. Right. So what we're going to look at briefly is a protocol known as TLS, which you may have also heard of SSL. So similar deals. The point of doing this is not to have you memorize all of the components of TLS. I want to illuminate to you just how complex these types of protocols are, but also to show you where the building blocks that you've seen today come up. So the part of TLS that I'm going to talk about is how the connection gets set up. It's known as the handshake. Right? So we have a client, we have a server. The first thing they need to do is agree on some parameters. So again, font's very small, I know, because there's a lot here. All right, I'll tell you what these things are. Right? The client sends a message with things like a protocol version, a random sequence number, some sort of potential like ciphers and compression schemes that it's able to use, right? The server will respond back with a bunch of stuff, right? It'll pick the version, it'll pick the cipher that they're going to use. It has its own sequence number that it sends. It'll give its certificate. It'll give a list of the certificate authorities that can validate that certificate, right? So at this point, the client is able to verify the authenticity of the server. So at this point, the client says, okay, yes, I'm communicating with the server that I thought I was communicating with, right? So that's good. So a lot of other parameters sent here that we didn't cover, right? But that's okay, right? At this point, the client is going to send a secret value, right? This is what is highlighted here as the pre-master secret. This is encrypted with the server's public key. You saw public key cryptography used for signatures. We can also use it for encryption. And in fact, you're going to see that on Wednesday. This is a little preview of what's going to happen on Wednesday, right? Once the server has that, the client and the server can compute a bunch of stuff together, right? They can compute this additional secret value known as the master secret. So you have a pre-master secret and a master secret, right? They have to take these two initial random values as input, right? And they compute all of these different keys, right? Keys for macking, keys for encrypting in both directions, right? Then they are finished. They sort of send these finished messages that confirm that, right? So again, if this were a cryptography class, we would spend a lot of time talking about why each of these components is necessary, right? Since it's not, the thing that I want you to take away, there's a couple things. One is just the complexity of this, right? A lot of the complexity comes from the fact that TLS has to support a lot of options and a lot of protocols, right? Some people will tell you that the code for like the TLS handshake is some of the most dangerous code in the world because so much can go wrong, right? You can also see here, again, we see some public key cryptography. We see secrets numbers. We see shared keys, symmetric keys being computed, right? So there's a lot going on here, right? Now, with the 1 minute left, I showed you at the beginning of lecture, not all traffic is encrypted by default, right? Evidenced by the fact that I could read packets, right? I could read packets in the air around me, right? So why not, right? We have ways to do this. We can encrypt traffic, right? Well, you know, end-to-end encryption hadn't really been a thing for most users until maybe 5 or so years ago, maybe a little bit longer. Historically, it's only been applied to transactions that obviously need to be secured. So like banking, right? These protocols are complex to implement. And in some ways, encryption can be expensive. Again, expensive in terms of the computation you need to do. But we're definitely moving towards a point where a lot more traffic is encrypted these days than it used to be, right? Which I mean, personally, I think is a very good thing, right? So that's kind of where we are, the landscape of cryptography. So this was a crash course on crypto for a lot of you. And again, we're not expecting you to come in with like the mathematical background for these things. That's okay. Right? The properties that we've given you about them are enough to understand how these are composed into secure systems. What we're going to do tomorrow in recitation, you're going to start to talk about DNSSEC, which is a proposal for securing different parts of DNS, which is kind of complementary to what we did today. On Wednesday in lecture, we're still going to imagine an adversary in the network, but on Wednesday, we're going to be concerned with dealing with packet headers. Right? Because if you're thinking, well, could we not just encrypt the packet headers? We can't, because switches in the middle of the network need to be able to read the headers, right? They don't all have our like decryption key, right? So we're gonna imagine that landscape. That is it for today. So let me stop sharing and stop recording.